In American cinema, justice usually lives indoors. Courthouses, police stations, city halls, heavy stone, long hallways, wood paneled rooms. These buildings exist to take the burden off the individual. They're meant to make justice less personal, less violent, less improvised. So justice doesn't have to be carried by whoever happens to be standing closest when something goes wrong. But American film keeps returning to the same moment. The moment when justice walks out the door.
Architectural outcasts.
Long before justice lived in buildings, it lived in people. And with Shane, like most Westerns, it lives in places that were never meant to last. The architecture of this world is temporary, provisional, unfinished. Homes are small, structures are light. Nothing is monumental, nothing claims permanence. These buildings don't express authority. They're shelters. They're markers of presence. They're ways of saying, we're here for now. Justice in this world has no space to retreat into. There are no courts capable of absorbing responsibility, no institutions sturdy enough to carry consequence on behalf of the community. So justice remains outside. And because it remains outside, it remains personal. Joe Starrett wants to act. He's willing to defend his family and his home, but he has a problem bigger than his lack of skill. And that's why Shane stops him. Not because Joe's wrong, but because Joe can't afford the cost. Shane understands something that Joe doesn't yet. When justice is carried personally, it doesn't end with the act. It follows the person who carries it. It reshapes them. It settles into their life. Joe Starrett is trying to build something meant to last. A family, a community, a future sturdy enough where justice might be able to move indoors someday. Shane isn't. So Shane takes on the burden instead. He does what needs to be done precisely so Joe doesn't become somebody he can't return from being. That's the cost of justice outside of institutions. It works, but it extracts a price from those who carry it. And once justice has done its work, it can't stay. Shane's departure isn't tragedy or romance, it's structural. That's the symbolism of the hero riding off into the sunset. Because even if you stay, the person you were before all this happened has already left town. Justice outside can only exist temporarily, like the buildings that surround it. If it stayed, it would prevent anything permanent from ever being built. That's why Shane leaves. And that's why institutions will eventually be needed. Not to replace justice, but to give it walls strong enough that ordinary people don't have to keep carrying it alone. As the frontier closed and cities rose, justice was invited indoors. The gangster films of the early 20th century sit right at this threshold. America is no longer provisional. It's becoming urban, dense, interconnected. And the old model of justice, personal and embodied, no longer scales. You can't settle a city the same way you settle a valley. So institutions emerged to take on the burden that no longer needed to be carried by individuals. In The Public Enemy, law begins to house itself, not tentatively, but deliberately. The architecture changes. Buildings grow heavier. Offices become formal. Courtrooms gain symmetry, hierarchy, and distance. These are no longer shelters or homesteads. They're statements. Stone instead of wood. Walls instead of open sky. Rooms designed to contain judgment. This is justice trying to become sustainable. The goal isn't control, it's restraint. By moving justice indoors, society's trying to slow it down, make it less reactive, less violent, less dependent upon the moral endurance of individual people. Responsibility is no longer carried by one man with the code. It's filtered across roles, procedures, and spaces. Architecture becomes moral infrastructure. These buildings exist to filter justice, to give it time to think, to keep it from following you home. Justice is meant to stay in the building now, handled by people whose job it is to decide, not by neighbors who are forced into impossible choices. For a while, the faith holds. The buildings stand. The doors are open. Justice believes it belongs inside. And for a time, it does. In the big heat, justice is still in the building. The doors haven't closed. The institutions are still functioning. The architecture still claims authority. But something has changed. The buildings that once promised relief now feel narrower. The rooms feel smaller. The hallways longer. The air heavier. Justice hasn't been expelled. It's been contained. This is what happens when institutions move from shelter to systems. Procedures multiply, chains of command lengthen, responsibility gets spread across desks, offices, procedures. No one decision is wrong, no one person is to blame, and that's the problem. The architecture reflects it perfectly. Offices feel compressed instead of supportive. Orderly but tense. Justice still happens here, but only by pushing against friction at every step. Movement slows. Justice isn't denied entry, it's delayed, redirected, buffeted by process. The protagonist isn't outside the law, he's trapped inside it, moving through a building that no longer allows him space to act. Doors open, but only partially. Hallways lead somewhere, just not where justice needs to go. Justice hasn't walked out yet, but it no longer feels at home. This is the quiet danger phase, the hardest to recognize, because everything still looks respectable. The buildings are intact, the desks are occupied, the rules are being followed, and yet justice is boxed in, compressed into spaces too small for the work it needs to do. Once this happens, only two outcomes remain. Either institutions adapt, or justice finds other ways to move. By the time we get to Dirty Harry, the institutions are fully built. The buildings are there. The offices are staffed. The procedures have been written down. In theory, justice has a home. In practice, it can't move through it. The architecture makes this immediate. Monumental stone buildings, elevated offices, wood-paneled rooms that are designed to signal seriousness and restraint. This is all built to endure, but the endurance has become inertia. Within these buildings, justice is slowed down by procedure, filtered through liability, redirected by policy. Decisions are no longer about right actions, but acceptable risk. The door that once welcomed justice inside now acts as a checkpoint. The question isn't, can justice act? It's, will justice be allowed to act? Harry Callahan doesn't begin outside the system. He's inside it. He has a badge. He follows rules. He works within the system as long as the system can respond. But the film is explicit where the failure occurs. Justice isn't radicalized, it's blocked. When Harry is inside offices, justice stalls. Behind a desk, work stops. Buried in paperwork, injustice continues elsewhere. Once justice leaves the building, movement returns. The film follows Harry through spaces that the institution can't inhabit comfortably. Streets, parks, playgrounds, rooftops, unfinished skyscrapers. These aren't symbolic choices, they're spatial ones. Justice has been forced back outside, not because the individual is better than the institution, but because the institution can no longer act in time. Harry doesn't reject law. Law rejects justice. Film doesn't celebrate this. It exposes it. The buildings still stand. The doors are still guarded. But justice can no longer pass through them. So justice walked out. Not as rebellion, but as consequence. By the time we get to Die Hard, justice being outside the building is no longer an emergency. It's assumed. The institutions still exist. They still arrive. They still set up perimeters and command posts. But no one believes they'll resolve the situation. Justice is already on the move. Nakatomi Plaza isn't civic architecture. It's corporate, vertical, sealed, glass, steel, elevators, service corridors, a building designed for efficiency, not to carry moral judgment. It looks permanent, it looks powerful, and is completely unprepared to carry justice. The institution surrounds the building. They negotiate, delay, wait for authorization. Justice can't. So justice moves inside the structure, but not into its offices or control spaces. It moves through vents, stairwells, service floors, unfinished spaces. Justice doesn't live here, it navigates. McClane doesn't belong in these spaces. He's injured, improvising, always one step behind the building itself. This isn't heroism as dominance, it's justice as endurance. And the audience isn't surprised by this. The institution's failure is baked into the premise. Justice outside is no longer tragic, it's procedural. The building becomes an obstacle course, neutral terrain, something to survive rather than trust. Justice isn't overthrowing institutions, it's compensating for them. And that compensation is paid for physically. Blood, exhaustion, isolation. Justice outside the building has become normalized. When we finally get to heat, justice no longer expects the door to open. The institutions still exist. They still function. They occupy buildings and budgets, but they no longer carry any moral authority. Justice exists between individuals, not as chaos, but as code. Men recognize each other by behavior, restraint, and consequence, not by affiliation. And the architecture reflects this. Los Angeles is vast, horizontal, impersonal. Freeways, warehouses, glass towers, anonymous interiors, spaces meant for movement and storage, not judgment and belonging. Doors still exist, but they don't lead anywhere justice can live. Police stations are procedural hubs. Corporate buildings are faceless. Homes feel temporary. Justice moves through encounters, not institutions. Heat isn't frontier nostalgia. There's no hope that justice will be reabsorbed back into the institution once order has been returned. The burden has returned back to the individual, not as emergency, but as condition. And it's colder now. In Shane, justice outside was temporary. In Heat, it feels permanent. The buildings remain, the systems function, but justice no longer trusts them to carry the burden. When you line these films up, a pattern emerges, a recognition of a conversation in American film about the relationship between justice and architecture. Justice started outside because it had to, so society built walls. They invited justice inside to share the burden, to slow it down, to make it less violent, less dependent upon whoever happened to be nearby. Architecture becomes a promise. You don't have to carry this alone anymore. And for a while, this promise holds. But institutions harden. They protect themselves. They start to prioritize continuity over purpose. When that happens, justice doesn't go anywhere. It waits. It pushes against doors that used to open. It wanders down hallways that no longer lead anywhere. And eventually, it leaves, not as rebellion, not as ideology, but as consequence. American film keeps returning to this moment because it reflects something instinctual. If institutions stop carrying justice, justice will reappear elsewhere. Not cleanly, not safely, but inevitably. This return is never celebrated. Shane has to leave. Harry can't stay inside. McLean bleeds for every step. Macaulay knows exactly how this is going to end. Justice outside isn't freedom. It's a fallback mode. And that's the warning embedded in all of this. These films aren't encouraging individuals to take justice into their own hands. They're warning institutions what happens when the doors stop opening. Buildings can stand for centuries. Systems can function indefinitely. Justice will only remain inside as long as it can move. When it can no longer move, it goes back outside. And it always starts the same way, by walking out the door. At any rate, I hope I gave you all something to think about, and until next time, y'all be safe. If y'all are still here, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. While you're at it, why don't you like this video, subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell. You can hear me yammer on about something else next time, and feel free to share this video far and wide.
Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment.